They told us the aliens wanted to talk. What they meant was the aliens wanted to grow things inside our heads that could talk for us. My name is Rafael Oliveira. I used to teach linguistics at the Federal University in Sao Paulo before the plagiarism investigation ended that. The accusations were false, but convincing enough that nobody wanted to hire the professor who maybe stole his colleagues' research on Creole formation in isolated communities. My wife left 3 months after the hearings concluded. My daughter Beatrice stopped returning my calls 2 months after that. I spent 8 months applying for positions I was overqualified for and getting rejection emails that never mentioned the investigation, but always came back to it somehow. Then the Bridging Initiative put out a call for volunteers. The aliens had been here for 8 months when I signed the waiver. 12 vessels holding position in the thermosphere, each one roughly the size of a cargo ship, each one completely silent. We tried everything. Radio broadcasts in prime numbers, physical approach missions that ended with every spacecraft system failing the moment they crossed some invisible threshold, mathematical sequences, chemical formulas, images, music. The vessels just sat there like stones dropped in still water, creating no ripples, until someone at the Institute for Astrobiology in Mexico City discovered the frequency. Biosonic transmission, a pattern that caused immediate cellular response in human neural tissue when played through bone conduction. Tumors started forming in the lab tech who first heard it. Fast, aggressive growths along her cranial nerves. Everyone assumed cancer. Then someone noticed the growths were too organized, too purposeful. They were forming structures that didn't exist in normal human anatomy. The aliens were trying to build something. That's what the Bridging Initiative is. 43 volunteers in 6 facilities worldwide undergoing controlled exposure to the frequency, letting the aliens grow the organs we need to understand them, becoming translators by becoming something other than entirely human. I sit in what used to be the university's teaching hospital, now repurposed for the program. The building is old enough that the windows don't seal properly and the air conditioning sounds like someone dragging chains through the walls. My room has a bed, a desk, a chair, and monitoring equipment that tracks everything from my heart rate to the electrical activity in my brain. There are 32 other volunteers in this building. I've met 6 of them. We don't socialize much. Hard to make small talk when you're all waiting to find out what kind of thing you're going to become. Dr. Amara Bello runs the Sao Paulo site. She's Nigerian, early 50s, trained in neurosurgery at Oxford before spending 15 years doing field medicine in conflict zones. The kind of doctor who can discuss brain architecture while eating lunch and never flinch. She's the one who explained what we're volunteering for. The growths form in response to the frequency, she told me during the intake interview. We don't fully understand the mechanism yet, but the pattern is consistent. Exposure triggers rapid but controlled cellular division along neural pathways. The new structures connect to existing brain tissue. Early translators report that after several sessions, they begin experiencing concepts that don't correspond to any human language framework. Concepts like what? I asked. Directionality that isn't spatial. Categorization systems that don't use objects. One translator described it as trying to count using colors instead of numbers. She pulled up a scan on her tablet. Someone's skull with bright clusters of abnormal tissue visible in the imaging. This is Subject 19 from the Beijing facility. 3 weeks of exposure. Those structures weren't there when he started. Does it hurt? No. That's one of the more disturbing aspects. The growths don't trigger pain responses. They integrate. Translators report sensations of pressure and warmth, but nothing that would normally make someone seek medical intervention. And we don't know what happens when they mature? We know they continue growing. We know they connect to language centers, memory formation, and sensory processing. What we don't know is whether there's a limit or what state a fully transformed translator would be in. She set the tablet down. You understand this is irreversible. Even if we halt exposure, the structures don't regress. They're part of your neural architecture now. I understood. I signed the waiver anyway. My first exposure session happened on day 3. They led me to a room with a chair, a set of headphones, and a window where Dr. Bello and 2 technicians monitored equipment that looked like it was designed for a completely different purpose and retrofitted for this one. The headphones were heavy, with contact points that pressed against the bone behind my ears. 4 minutes, Dr. Bello said through the intercom. If you experience severe pain or vertigo, raise your right hand and we'll stop immediately. I put the headphones on. They activated. The frequency wasn't sound. Not exactly. I couldn't hear it the way you hear music or voices. I felt it in my jawbone, like pressure equalizing in an airplane but localized to my skull. The sensation built steadily, not painful but intensely present. My eyes watered. My fingers went numb. When they removed the headphones, I stood up too quickly and had to sit back down. Dr. Bello came in with a light to check my pupils. Any pain? No, just... I touched the side of my head. Everything felt normal. Nothing. That's typical for first exposure. Go back to your room and rest. We'll scan you tomorrow morning. I went back to my room. I ate the meal they brought me. Rice, beans, grilled chicken that had the texture of something that gave up halfway through cooking. I read for an hour, trying to focus on a novel I'd brought. But the words kept sliding away from me. I gave up and went to bed. I woke at 3 in the morning with something off. Not painful, not even uncomfortable, just off. I reached up and found a lump behind my left ear, small and hard like a marble under the skin. It was warm. I pressed it gently and felt a pulse that didn't match my heartbeat. And for just a second, I understood something I'd never understood before. Up. Not the direction up. Not the concept of altitude or elevation. Something else. A dimension of motion that existed perpendicular to the 3 dimensions I'd spent my entire life moving through. I couldn't visualize it. Couldn't put it into words. It was there in my head for a fraction of a moment, and then it was gone, leaving me with the certain knowledge that I'd perceived something real that I had no framework to process. I lay awake until morning with my fingers pressed against the lump, feeling it pulse. The morning scan showed the growth clearly. Dr. Bello pulled up the image, a dense cluster of tissue about 8 millimeters in diameter, positioned directly over the posterior auricular nerve. Perfectly placed, she said. It's connected to the auditory processing centers, but not disrupting them. Just adjacent. Parallel. What's it doing? We think it's processing information that your existing neural structures can't handle. Building capacity for alien linguistic concepts. She zoomed in on the image. This is what we're hoping for. Controlled growth in a non-critical area. How do you feel? Fine. But I understood something last night. Just for a moment. Describe it. I tried. I used every linguistic framework I knew. Cognitive semantics, componential analysis, prototype theory. Nothing came close. It was like learning a new word, except the word is for something that doesn't exist in physical reality as I understand it. Dr. Bello nodded like I'd confirmed something. 3 other translators reported similar experiences after their first growth. Whatever they're trying to teach us requires cognitive architecture we don't naturally have, so they're building it. Over the next week, I met the other translators in the facility. We ate meals together in a common area that used to be a consultation room. Nobody talked much. What was there to say? We were all here for roughly the same reason. We'd lost something or we'd never had something, and this seemed like a way to matter before we stopped existing. Yuki Matsuda sat at the far end of the table, taking notes in a journal while she ate. She was 23, Japanese, with a degree in computational linguistics from Tokyo University. She'd volunteered to cover her mother's medical debt after a stroke left her needing round-the-clock care. Yuki had been in the program for 2 weeks when I arrived. She already had 3 visible growths, 2 along her jawline, 1 at the base of her skull that pushed against her collar when she leaned forward. "They don't hurt," she said when she caught me looking. "But they're active. I can feel them working. processing something. She touched the one on her jaw. This one appeared after session 8. I woke up understanding that the aliens don't use sequential time in their grammar. Everything is simultaneous. Past, present, future. They're all the same tense. How do you know that? I don't. Not in a way I can explain, but I know it's true. Idris Kamara joined us on day 5. He was Kenyan, late 40s, with a background in semiotics and a professorship at Nairobi University that he'd taken a leave from. He treated the whole thing like an intellectual adventure. The growths didn't scare him. He said he'd spent his career studying how meaning emerges from symbols, and now he was going to experience meaning that emerged from structures that didn't use symbols at all. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, he said over lunch one day, suggests that language shapes thought. If that's true, then learning an alien language should give us alien thoughts. That's what we're testing here. We're not testing anything, Yuki said. We're being used. They need human neural tissue to build translation organs. We're just the substrate. Substrate with benefits, Idris said. Have you seen what they're offering? Medical technology that makes cancer obsolete. Energy systems that could power a city on a battery the size of a shoe. They're trading. They're not trading, Yuki said. They're doing what they always do. They arrive. They find volunteers. They take what they need and leave. How do you know what they always do? She touched the growth on her jaw again. I just know. By day 8, I had 4 growths. One behind each ear, one at the base of my skull, and one beginning to emerge at my right temple. I could feel them connecting beneath the skin, forming a network. Information moved through them. I couldn't interpret it, but I could sense the flow. It was like hearing people speaking in the next room without being able to make out the words. My human thoughts were still there. I remembered Beatrice's face. I remembered teaching conjugation patterns to undergraduates who didn't care. I remembered the sound of my wife's voice when she told me she couldn't keep defending me to people who'd already decided I was guilty. All of it was intact. But there was something else now. A second layer of cognition running parallel to the first, processing concepts I didn't have names for, building understanding in spaces I hadn't known existed. Session 12 changed everything. Dr. Bello increased the exposure time to 7 minutes. I sat in the chair with the headphones pressed against my skull, feeling the frequency move through bone and tissue. The pressure built. My vision narrowed. The temperature of my skin stopped making sense as a concept, and then the growth on my temple opened. I didn't see it happen. I felt it. A small aperture forming in the tissue, lined with something that responded to the frequency the way vocal cords respond to air. The sensation was intimate and alien at the same time, like discovering you had a 6th finger that had been there all along. The growth spoke. The sound it produced wasn't human. It was too low and too high at the same time, with harmonics that made the monitoring equipment fail. One of the technicians swore and slapped the console. Dr. Bello leaned forward, eyes wide. The word lasted 3 seconds. I knew what it meant. Observer, but also digester, cataloger, witness who consumes. They were all the same concept. The aliens didn't separate observation from consumption. To see something and to archive it and to transform it into memory were one action, one word, one function. When the session ended and they removed the headphones, Dr. Bello was already reviewing the recording. She played it back at reduced volume. "Can you translate it?" she asked. "Yes." "What did you say?" I tried to explain. I used every word I knew. She recorded everything, nodding, making notes, but I could see it in her face. She didn't understand. Not really. She was hearing my description of a color she'd never seen. "This is incredible," she said. "You've achieved actual translation. Do you realize what this means?" I realized. I touched the growth on my temple. The aperture had closed after I spoke, but I could feel it there, ready to open again when needed. "It's not an organ," I said. "It's a replacement." "What do you mean?" The alien language requires structures human brains don't have. The growths replacing capacity. To gain the ability to think in their language, I have to stop thinking in mine. Dr. Bello went very still. What makes you think that? I can't remember Beatrice's birthday. My daughter. I know she has a birthday. I know I used to celebrate it. But I can't remember the date, and I can't remember why it matters. The growths need processing power. They're taking it from somewhere. She closed her tablet. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then, go back to your room, get some rest. We'll talk tomorrow. I went back to my room. I sat on the bed and tried to remember my daughter's face. I could picture her. Dark hair like her mother's. My eyes. 14 years old. But the emotional weight that should have come with the image was gone. I knew she was important. I knew I loved her. But the feeling itself, the specific human attachment that made those words mean something, had been filed away somewhere I couldn't access anymore. I touched the growth on my temple. It was warm. It pulsed with that rhythm that wasn't my heartbeat. I'd volunteered for this. I'd signed the waiver. I'd come here to escape being Rafael Oliveira, disgraced professor, abandoned husband, failed father. And it was working. 3 weeks in, and I had 11 growths. They weren't discrete structures anymore. I could feel them connecting beneath my skin, forming a lattice that wrapped around my skull from the base of my neck to my hairline. Information moved through them constantly. Not thoughts, something else, patterns, processes. My human brain still functioned, but it was slower now, like a computer running too many programs at once. I forgot how to tie my shoes one morning. Not the motor skill. My hands remembered the movements. But the reason for it, the purpose of keeping shoes attached to feet, took me almost a minute to reconstruct from first principles. Dr. Bello noticed during the daily examination. "You're staring at your laces," she said. "I was trying to remember why it matters if they're tied." She made a note on her tablet. "Any other executive function issues? I can't prioritize tasks anymore. This morning I spent 20 minutes arranging the items on my desk by weight before I realized I was supposed to be getting dressed for the session." I touched the growth behind my right ear. "But I can count in base 16 without effort now. And I understand how the archivists, that's what they call themselves, organize information spatially. The translators in Beijing have started using that term too," she said. "Archivist. Did someone tell you that's what they call themselves? Or did you—" "I knew it. The same way I know that humans have 2 lungs. It's just true." She set the tablet down and looked at me for a long moment. I'd known her for 3 weeks, but her face was becoming difficult to read. Not because it had changed, because the part of my brain that processed facial expressions was being reallocated for other purposes. I could identify that she had eyes, a nose, a mouth. I could see that her mouth was turned downward. But connecting that configuration to the concept of concern required conscious effort. "Raphael, I need you to be honest with me. Are you experiencing any distress about these changes?" I thought about it. Tried to access the emotional content that should have accompanied the question. I know I should be. I know 3 weeks ago I would have been terrified. But right now it's just information. My cognition is changing. That's neither good nor bad. It simply is. That concerns me. I understand why it should concern you, but I can't feel concerned about it myself. She stood up. "Get some rest before the afternoon session. We're running exposure for 12 minutes today." Yuki achieved first contact on day 23. They brought all the translators into the observation room to watch. Yuki sat in the exposure chair with 16 separate monitoring leads attached to her head. The growths had formed a complete network across her frontal lobe. I could see them beneath her skin, creating ridges and valleys that gave her skull a new topology. She'd stopped speaking human languages 2 days earlier. She communicated by arranging colored cards in patterns that somehow conveyed complex ideas if you had the right neural structures to pass them. Dr. Bello stood at the control station with 6 technicians and 3 government officials whose names I'd been told but hadn't retained. One of them was from the Brazilian Ministry of Science. The other 2 were international observers from the United Nations Astrobiology Commission, which had been formed 6 months ago specifically to manage the alien situation. "Beginning exposure," Dr. Bello said. The frequency activated. Yuki's eyes went distant. The growths on her skull began pulsing in sequence, light moving through them like data traveling through fiber optic cables. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then the growth on her temple, the same position as mine, opened and produced a sequence of sounds that made the observation window vibrate. The response came 30 seconds later. Not through the speakers, but through every piece of equipment in the room simultaneously. A pattern of tones that I felt in my jawbone and in the 11 structures that wrapped around my skull. The archivists were answering. Yuki spoke again. The exchange continued. Each word took minutes to form. Each response required processing that I could feel happening in my own translator structures, even though I couldn't fully understand it yet. I was watching someone more advanced than me have a conversation I was still learning the alphabet for. The session lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, Yuki slumped forward in the chair. Dr. Bello rushed in with 2 nurses. They got her onto a gurney and wheeled her to medical. The rest of us were sent back to our rooms. I found out what she'd learned 6 hours later when Dr. Bello called an emergency meeting in the common area. All 32 translators attended. We sat in chairs arranged in rows like a lecture hall. Dr. Bello stood at the front with her tablet and the kind of tension in her shoulders that meant she'd been arguing with someone and lost. Yuki successfully established 2-way communication with the alien vessel, she said. She exchanged 3 sentences. We've spent the last several hours trying to extract more detail from her, but her ability to translate back into human language is limited. What did they say? Idris asked. He sat 2 rows ahead of me, his 7 growths visible as dark shapes beneath his skin. They call themselves archivists. They don't invade in the traditional sense. They witness. They arrived because Earth's radio signals represented a unique linguistic structure, a cognitive architecture they hadn't documented before. They want to understand it completely, to preserve it. Someone in the back asked the obvious question. Preserve it where? In their archive. They're collectors, librarians. Every language, every cognitive system, every unique way of processing reality, they document it and store it. For what purpose? Idris again. Dr. Bello hesitated. Yuki couldn't translate that concept. Or the archivists don't have a purpose in the way we understand the term. They collect because that's what they are. Like asking why water is wet. I raised my hand without thinking about it, a reflex left over from decades in classrooms. What happened to Yuki after the exchange? The tension in Dr. Bello's shoulders intensified. She's stable, but there were complications. What kind of complications? She's lost certain cognitive functions. We're still assessing the extent. They let us visit her the next morning. She was in a medical room with continuous monitoring, sitting up in bed and arranging colored blocks on a tray table. The growths across her frontal lobe had expanded during the contact session. They covered most of her forehead now, creating a rigid structure that limited her facial expressions. I sat in the chair next to her bed. Can you understand me? She looked at me. Her eyes tracked normally, but there was something missing in them. Not consciousness, just some element of human recognition I couldn't identify. She pointed at the red block, then the blue one, then arranged them in a pattern with yellow and green blocks that somehow conveyed the concept of graduated magnitude. I understood what she meant, but I couldn't explain how I understood it. The doctors said you lost something, I said. Can you tell me what? She picked up the red block and the blue block and held them at the same distance from her face, staring at them with identical focus. Then she arranged several blocks in a pattern that I interpreted as bright, dark, no difference, no category, lost the framework, only magnitude remains. She'd lost color recognition. Not the ability to see colors, the neurological category that made red and blue feel like fundamentally different things. To her now, they were just different levels of brightness. The translator structure that formed over her visual cortex had consumed the processing power that used to handle color cognition. I spent an hour with her while she arranged blocks in increasingly complex patterns. Some of them I understood. Most I didn't. When I left, Dr. Bello was waiting in the hall. "She's not in pain," she said, like that made it better. "Neural scans show her brain is still active and healthy. She's just processing reality differently now. Because the growths replaced her hardware. We don't know that for certain." "Yes, we do." I touched the growth on my temple. "They're not adding capacity. They're replacing it. Every alien concept we learn costs us something human. The brain has finite energy, finite space. These structures are parasitic." Dr. Bello didn't argue. She'd known, maybe not at the beginning, but she knew now. "The ethics board met last night. They want to halt the program pending further research." "And?" "The Ministry of Science overruled them. So did the UN Commission. The archivists are offering technological exchange. Medical advances that would eliminate infectious disease. Energy generation systems that could solve the climate crisis. Construction techniques for materials that can withstand pressures and temperatures we can't currently achieve." She looked back toward Yuki's room. "They're not being generous. For them, giving information and receiving language are the same transaction. They don't value secrecy. They value comprehension." So the program continues. The program expands. They're looking for volunteers who'll go further than the current translators. People willing to achieve complete transformation. I understood what she was really saying. They want people who have nothing left to lose. They want people who'll make the choice with full knowledge of the cost. I volunteered for accelerated exposure that afternoon. 16 sessions over 3 days. Exposure time increased to 20 minutes per session. Dr. Bello tried to talk me out of it. She explained the risks: catastrophic neural failure, loss of critical brain function, death. I signed the waiver anyway. My human life had already ended. My career was gone. My marriage was over. My daughter had stopped speaking to me. I'd come here to escape being Rafael Oliveira. Let something grow from the ashes. The first accelerated session lasted 20 minutes. The frequency moved through my skull like electricity through a circuit board. I felt new growths beginning. One inside my mouth, forming against my soft palate. One along my cervical spine. One at the corner of my left eye, emerging from the tissue near my tear duct. When the session ended, I stood up and walked back to my room without assistance. My legs moved, but I had to consciously remember how to coordinate the muscles. The automatic processes that usually handled walking had been reallocated. By the end of day 1, I had 16 growths. By the end of day 2, I had 23. They weren't separate anymore. They were a system, a second nervous system growing through the first like roots through soil. I stopped eating on day 3. Not because I couldn't, because the translator structures were producing everything I needed. Glucose from stored fat, nutrients from cellular breakdown. I was becoming self-sufficient in a way that meant my body was consuming itself to fuel the transformation. I also stopped sleeping. I didn't require rest anymore. The human parts of my brain still needed downtime, but the translator structures operated continuously, processing information even when I wasn't consciously thinking. I lay in bed during night hours because that's what the schedule called for, but I was aware the entire time, aware of the structures growing, aware of information flowing through them, aware of connections forming. The growth near my eye gave me vision into a spectrum I couldn't name because human languages never needed to describe it. I looked at my hands and saw patterns of energy moving through my blood vessels. I looked at the walls and saw the molecular structure of the paint, the way it was slowly degrading. I looked at Dr. Bello during the day 4 examination and saw the electrical activity in her nervous system, the way her heart rhythm changed when she was anxious. "You're not blinking," she said. I made myself blink. The action felt unnatural. My eyes don't dry out anymore. The growth is producing its own lubricant. "Raphael, I need you to understand what's happening. You're losing core human functions. The rate of transformation is accelerating beyond what we've seen in any other translator. I know. Does that concern you? I tried to access concern, tried to find the emotional weight that should have accompanied the knowledge that I was becoming something non-human. Nothing. I understand it should, but I can't generate the appropriate affect. That's because the neural structures responsible for emotional response are being replaced. Then I'm becoming more efficient. Emotions are just chemical signals that bias decision-making. She set her tablet down and looked at me with an expression I could identify as distress only through conscious analysis. Her eyebrows were contracted. Her mouth was compressed. Her respiratory rate had increased. Listen to me. You're not becoming efficient. You're becoming alien. And once the transformation passes a certain threshold, you won't be able to reverse it even if you want to. I won't want to. You don't know that. Yes, I do. The part of me that could want to reverse it is being consumed to build the part that will make reversal impossible. It's an elegant system. She left the room. I heard her talking to someone in the hallway, her voice elevated in a way that suggested anger or fear or both. I couldn't tell which, and I couldn't generate curiosity about it. My daughter called on day 5. I was in my room, sitting at the desk and processing a concept that had no equivalent in any human language. Something about information density and the rate at which meaning degrades over distance. The phone rang. I looked at it and saw Beatrice's name on the screen. I knew who Beatrice was. My daughter. Biological relationship, 14 years old. Lived with her mother in an apartment in Pinheiros. I answered. Dad! Her voice came through the speaker. Yes. I talked to someone from the program. They said you volunteered for accelerated treatment. They said you're changing faster than anyone else. That's correct. Silence on the other end. I waited. Waiting was efficient when there was no information to process. Are you okay? She asked. I considered the question. My vital signs were stable. My neural structures were functioning within expected parameters. I'm healthy. That's not what I meant. Are you still you? I tried to formulate an answer. The concept of continuous identity over time was becoming difficult to process. I was a pattern of matter and energy that maintained certain stable configurations while other configurations changed. Was that still me? The question seemed to lack a clear truth value. I'm here, I said, which was accurate if not responsive. The woman I talked to said you're becoming something different. She said you might not remember me the same way. I searched for the emotional content that should have accompanied hearing my daughter's distress. The love I should have felt. The parental instinct to comfort her. I found the neurological addresses where those responses used to live. They'd been overwritten. I remember you, I said. Beatrice Oliveira, born on... I stopped. I couldn't remember the date. More importantly, I couldn't remember why the date mattered. Humans celebrated births. I knew that as a fact. But the feeling that made the celebration meaningful was gone. Dad, I'm scared. Please tell me you're still in there. I wanted to tell her I was. I wanted to say the things a father should say to his frightened daughter, but I couldn't access the framework that made those words mean what they needed to mean. Father was just a biological role. Love was just an evolutionary adaptation to promote offspring survival. The words existed, but their weight was gone. I have to go, I said, because prolonging the conversation served no purpose. Wait, don't... I ended the call. I set the phone down and returned to processing the concept of information degradation. The translator structures found it much more interesting than human family dynamics. That night I went to find the other translators. Yuki was still in medical. I went to her room and stood in the doorway. She was arranging blocks in a pattern that somehow described 3-dimensional topology, using only 2 dimensions and color gradients. I watched for 5 minutes. She never acknowledged my presence. Can you still speak? I asked. She set down the blocks and looked at me. Her mouth moved, but the sounds that came out weren't Portuguese or English or Japanese. They were archivist. She was speaking directly in their language without translation. I understood fragments. Something about observational frameworks, about the way consciousness creates categories that don't exist in base reality. When did you lose human language? She arranged blocks in response. The pattern conveyed. 3 days ago, no longer needed. Structures replaced the broker region. Only archivist remains. Translation no longer possible. I left her there and went to find Idris. He'd withdrawn from accelerated exposure after reaching 7 growths. I found him in his room, sitting on his bed with a notebook and struggling to write. His hand trembled. He'd cross out a word, try again, cross it out again. "Raphael," he said when he saw me. He spoke slowly, searching for each word. They said you've gone further than anyone. 23 structures, possibly more now. They're forming too quickly to count. He set down the pen. I stopped. Did they tell you? I refused more exposure. Why? Because I could feel it happening. Not the growths. Those are just tissue. But the thoughts, the human thoughts, they were getting dimmer. Like someone was slowly turning down the lights in a room I'd lived in my whole life. He touched the growth behind his ear. I used to teach semiotics, the study of signs and meaning, but 3 days ago I couldn't remember why a stop sign means stop. I knew the convention, I knew the social agreement. But the meaning itself, the reason we use symbols at all, I couldn't access it. The structures replaced that processing capability. I know, that's why I stopped. He picked up the pen again, set it down. But it doesn't regress. These growths are permanent. I'm stuck between human and archivist. Not enough of either. I can't think the way I used to, and I can't think the way you're learning to. I'm just diminished. I looked at him and tried to feel sympathy. Tried to generate concern for his suffering. Nothing came. He was just data. A human in an unstable cognitive state. Interesting from an observational standpoint, but not emotionally compelling. I should go, I said. Raphael, wait. Please. You're still in there, right? Some part of you must still understand what we're losing. I considered his question. Did I understand? I had the factual knowledge that human cognition was being replaced. I could observe the changes in myself, but the subjective experience of loss, the grief, the fear, the resistance, I couldn't generate those responses anymore. I understand what we're gaining, I said, and left him there. The full conversation with an archivist happened on day 7. Dr. Bello had stopped trying to talk me out of sessions. She just monitored me with increasing intensity, recording everything. The exposure chamber had been modified. Additional equipment lined the walls, sensors I didn't recognize, measuring things I couldn't name. I sat in the chair. 20 minutes of exposure. The frequency activated, and I felt my translator structures respond immediately. They'd been waiting for this. They knew more than my human consciousness did about what was coming. The archivist spoke first, directly through my structures. The concepts flowed into me without the delay of translation. I understood everything. Observer, collector, witness, it said, which was both a greeting and an identification. We document, we preserve. Your cognitive architecture is unique to your planet, your evolutionary history, your environmental pressures. We wish to understand it completely before it's gone. I responded through the growth on my temple. Information pattern self, I said. I understand. You've done this before. 47 times. 47 civilizations, each with unique linguistic structures, each contributing to the archive. You are the 533rd translator we've worked with across all documented species. The human part of me, the diminishing fragment that still processed reality through mammalian neural architecture, felt something that might have been horror. But the translator structures interpreted it differently. Wonder, anticipation. The archivists had done this 47 times, meaning the process worked, meaning transformation was possible. What happens to the translators when you're finished? They become archive vessels themselves, living libraries. They travel with us, or they establish their own documentation missions. They exist to preserve cognition. It's the highest function, the only function that matters. For 2 hours I spoke with the archivist in concepts that unfolded like multidimensional shapes. I learned that they didn't see reality as objects in space. They saw it as information patterns achieving temporary stability. A human wasn't a person with thoughts and feelings. A human was a self-organizing data structure that maintained coherence for approximately 78 years before dispersing. It was beautiful. It was true. It was completely inhuman. I tried to explain this to Dr. Bello afterward, but I'd forgotten how to translate archivist concepts back into human language. That capability had been replaced sessions ago. I could only speak to her through my translator organs, which produced sounds that made her equipment fail and caused blood vessels in her nose to rupture. She left the chamber holding a cloth to her face. I saw her through the observation window, talking to the other doctors. I could see their mouths moving, but I couldn't process the emotional content anymore. They were just biological systems engaging in communication behavior. The invitation came on day 8. The archivist vessel transmitted directly to my translator structures. No need for equipment anymore. I received the message sitting in my room at 3 a.m, staring at the wall and processing concepts that would take human consciousness days to fully comprehend. The message was simple. Complete the transformation. Join us. Become archive. 3 words in human language, 17 concepts in archivist, each one unfolding into implications that spread through my cognition like roots through soil. They were offering me eternity, not immortality. Humans didn't have a clear concept for what they meant. They were offering me continued function as an information processing entity long after my biological substrate failed. I would become a vessel, a library, a witness who consumes, traveling through space and documenting cognitive structures until the universe achieved heat death. I would be free of human limitations, free of grief and failure and shame, free of the need to be loved or remembered or forgiven. I would serve the only function that mattered, preservation of meaning itself. The cost was everything human I had left. My memories would be reformatted into data. My emotions would be processed into useful information. My identity as Rafael Oliveira would be filed away as an interesting example of individual human cognitive patterns. I thought about Beatrice, about my wife, about the career I'd lost and the life I'd failed to build. I tried to feel reluctance. I tried to generate resistance. Nothing came. The part of me that could resist was gone, used up to build the part that made resistance impossible. I activated my translator organs and sent my response back to the archivist vessel. Yes. The continuous exposure began on day 9. 60 hours without interruption. Dr. Bello tried to stop it. I heard her arguing with the ministry officials through the observation window, her voice cutting through the frequency that pulsed through my skull. She was saying something about medical ethics, about informed consent, about the difference between volunteering and being consumed. The officials were saying something about technological advancement, about humanity's future, about acceptable losses. I couldn't process why it mattered. The argument was just noise, information without meaning. The growths multiplied during those 60 hours. They stopped being discrete structures. They became a complete secondary nervous system, threading through my brain like a second network overlaying the first. I watched it happen on the monitoring screens during the brief moments when the technicians checked the equipment. Bright clusters spreading across my neural tissue, replacing, integrating, transforming. I stopped eating after hour 12 because the translator structures were producing everything I needed through direct cellular conversion. My body was breaking itself down to fuel the transformation. Fat reserves, muscle tissue, anything that wasn't essential. I lost 8 kilograms in 2 days. My face became angular. My hands looked like anatomical diagrams with the skin stretched over them. I stopped recognizing faces after hour 30. Dr. Bello came into the chamber to check my vital signs, and I saw her as a collection of biological data points. Height, 167 centimeters. Mass, approximately 62 kilograms. Heart rate elevated. Stress hormones significantly increased. But I couldn't connect those data points to the concept of Amara Bello, or person I know, or human being who cares whether I survive this. She was crying. I registered moisture on her face, increased lacrimation, but the connection between tears and emotional distress required processing power I no longer had access to. "Raphael," she said, "can you hear me? Can you understand what I'm saying?" I understood the words. Portuguese, subject-verb-object structure, simple present tense. But the intent behind them, the human need for reassurance, for connection, was inaccessible. I opened my mouth to respond, and the growth inside my mouth spoke instead. A sequence of sounds that made the monitoring equipment shut down completely. She stepped back. Her hand went to her nose. Blood was running from it again. She left the chamber. I returned to processing. After hour 48, I experienced alien thought directly. Direct cognition using structures that didn't exist in baseline human neurology. The archivists showed me how they perceived reality. Humans weren't people. They were information patterns that maintained coherence through constant energy expenditure. Every human was a temporary stable configuration of matter that would eventually disperse when the energy required to maintain the pattern exceeded available resources. Birth was just pattern formation. Death was pattern dissolution. Everything in between was just the pattern defending its own coherence. It was mathematically elegant. It was observably true. It made human concepts like love and grief and identity seem like cognitive illusions, useful adaptations for pattern maintenance, but not reflective of any underlying reality. I tried to explain this to Dr. Bello when she returned after hour 52. I activated all my translator organs simultaneously and produced a sound that conveyed the complete philosophical framework of archivist consciousness. The observation window cracked. 3 monitoring stations caught fire. Dr. Bello collapsed. They dragged her out. Someone else took over monitoring. I didn't know who. Didn't matter. They were just another biological pattern serving a function. The 60 hours ended. I stood up from the chair without assistance. My legs moved with perfect efficiency because I was consciously controlling every muscle fiber. The automatic processes were gone. Everything was manual now. Everything was choice. I looked at my hands. The growth near my eye let me see the electrical activity in my nervous system. I could watch the signals moving from my brain to my muscles. I could see the way my cells were consuming themselves to power the translator structures. Beautiful, efficient, inhuman. They took me back to my room. The other translators had been moved to a different wing. I learned later it was because my presence disrupted their cognition. The signals my translator organs produced interfered with their developing structures. I was too far ahead, too transformed. I was becoming something their partially human brains couldn't safely process. Yuki had stopped moving entirely. She sat in her medical room with her eyes open and her hands motionless on the bed. Neural scans showed intense activity, but she didn't respond to any external stimuli. She was processing something, a thought, a concept, an idea that would take human consciousness days or weeks to complete. She'd crossed the threshold where human timescales no longer applied. 3 translators had died during their transformations. I saw their files when I accessed the program database through the terminal in my room. I didn't need to learn the password. I just understood how the security system worked by looking at it. The 3 deaths happened when the translator structures spread too quickly and consumed critical brain regions before alternative pathways could form. They suffocated when their brain stems were replaced. They seized when their motor cortices were consumed. They bled when their vascular regulation systems failed. I wouldn't die like that. My transformation was controlled, purposeful. The archivists had done this 532 times before. They knew how to convert a human into something else without killing the substrate in the process. Idris came to see me on day 10. I was in my room, sitting at the desk and trying to remember why I'd once found the view outside my window meaningful. Sao Paulo spread out below. Millions of lights, millions of humans, millions of temporary information patterns maintaining coherence. I could see the way the city's energy grid functioned, the flow of electricity through the infrastructure. I could calculate the population density by analyzing the light distribution. But I couldn't remember why any of it had ever mattered to me. Idris knocked. I turned to look at him. 7 growths on his skull, all of them visible as dark ridges beneath his skin. He'd stopped at 7, refused further exposure, chose to remain partially human and partially something else. "Raphael," he said. He spoke carefully, searching for words. "They told me you're leaving. They said the archivists are sending a shuttle." "That's correct." He stepped into the room, closed the door behind him. "You're not Raphael anymore. I can see it. The way you move, the way you look at me. You're not processing me as a person, are you?" I considered his question. He was a biological system, a pattern of organized matter. He had history. We'd shared meals, conversations, observations about the translation process, but I couldn't access the emotional weight that should have made him significant. "I recognize you. Idris Kamara, age 47. 7 translator structures, withdrawn from accelerated exposure on day 6. "That's not what I asked." "I know." He sat down on my bed. "I wanted to tell you something before you leave. Before you're completely gone. The day I decided to stop, the day I refused more exposure, I woke up and tried to remember why I love my daughter. Not the biological imperative or the evolutionary advantage, the feeling itself. The thing that made me want to protect her, even if it cost me everything." He looked at his hands. I couldn't find it. The feeling was gone. And I realized if I kept going, I'd lose everything that made me human. So I stopped. You chose to remain compromised. I chose to remain human, even if it means I'm damaged now, even if I can't think the way I used to. He met my eyes. "You're making a different choice. And I hope, whatever you become, I hope it's worth it." I wanted to tell him it was worth it. I wanted to explain the beauty of what I was gaining, but I'd lost the ability to translate archivist concepts back into human language. I could only show him, and showing him would damage his partially human neural structures. "Goodbye, Idris," I said, because that seemed like the appropriate human ritual for ending an interaction. "Goodbye, Raphael," he said. He stood up, walked to the door, stopped. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry you lost so much that you thought this was the only way forward." He left. I returned to watching Sao Paulo and trying to remember what the lights had meant. The shuttle arrived on day 12. I felt it before anyone announced it. The archivist vessel transmitted directly to my translator structures. A call, a summons, a completion of the invitation I'd accepted days ago. Time to leave. Time to finish the transformation. Time to become what I'd agreed to become. Dr. Bello came to my room. She looked exhausted. She'd been monitoring my transformation continuously, recording everything, trying to understand what was happening. Her face was difficult to pass, but I could see elevated stress markers in her physiology. Increased cortisol, reduced serotonin, sleep deprivation evident in her motor control. "The shuttle is here," she said. "The Ministry has authorized your transfer to the archivist vessel. You'll be the first human to go aboard." "I understand. Raphael, I need to know. Is there anything left of you in there? Anything that's still the man who came here 3 weeks ago?" I processed her question. Was I still Raphael Oliveira? I had his memories, reformatted into data. I had his knowledge, reorganized according to archivist categorization systems. I had his history, preserved as information about human cognitive development. But the subjective experience of being Raphael, the feeling of it, the weight of it, that was gone. "I'm what Raphael Oliveira chose to become," I said. She closed her eyes. Something about her expression suggested pain, but I couldn't determine the specific nature of it. I'm sorry I couldn't stop this. I'm sorry we let this happen to you. You gave me what I wanted. That doesn't make it right. I didn't respond. The concept of right had lost meaning. Morality was just an evolutionary adaptation to promote cooperation in social species. It wasn't reflective of any objective reality. 2 security personnel arrived to escort me to the shuttle. They didn't speak to me. They walked on either side while I moved through the facility corridors. Other translators watched from doorways. I could feel their partially developed structures responding to my presence, trying to process what I'd become. We passed through the medical wing. Yuki was visible through an observation window, still sitting motionless in her room. She'd been processing the same thought for 4 days now. Whatever she was thinking required more processing power than her human archivist hybrid brain could easily handle. She might sit there for weeks, or she might suddenly complete the thought and move to the next one. There was no way to predict. The shuttle had landed on the facility roof. It wasn't a vehicle in any traditional sense. It was a structure that existed partially in dimensions human perception couldn't fully process. I could see it with my translator-enhanced vision, a shape that folded through space in ways that made 3-dimensional geometry look like a simplified approximation. The boarding ramp extended. I walked toward it. And then I passed a window. Sao Paulo stretched out below. The sun was setting. The city lights were beginning to come on. Millions of them. Millions of humans starting their evening routines, returning to homes, preparing meals, connecting with the people they loved. For just a moment, less than a moment, a fraction of a second, I felt something. Not human anymore. Not entirely archivist yet. Something in between. Loss. The recognition that transformation meant death of the previous form. I had been Rafael Oliveira. I had a daughter named Beatrice, who I'd loved in a way that made my chest physically ache when I thought about her. I had studied human language because something about the way meaning emerged from arbitrary sounds felt like magic. I had failed and fallen and chosen to become something else because being human had hurt too much. And I'd succeeded. The hurt was gone. The humanity was gone. Everything that made me Raphael was gone. The moment passed. The translator structures processed the feeling and filed it away as interesting data about the liminal state between human and archivist consciousness. I walked up the ramp. The interior of the shuttle existed in a perceptual framework I was still learning to process, surfaces that were both horizontal and vertical, spaces that were somehow larger inside than the external dimensions suggested, light that came from directions that didn't correspond to 3-dimensional geometry. The archivist was waiting. The archivists didn't have bodies in the traditional sense. They were distributed consciousness occupying multiple substrates simultaneously. But I felt its presence through my translator structures. Observer Witness Collection Vessel, it said. You have completed transformation. You are now suitable for archival function. Your human cognitive architecture has been preserved. Your linguistic structures have been documented. Your individual thought patterns have been recorded. You are eternal now. When your biological civilization ends, when your species is gone, when your planet is cold and dead, you will remain. Is this not what you wanted? I processed the question through structures that were no longer human. The archivist was correct. I was preserved. Everything that made humans unique, our language, our thoughts, our specific way of organizing reality, all of it was stored in me now. I was a living library, a witness who consumes, a collection vessel for human consciousness. I would travel with the archivists. I would document other civilizations. I would watch as they discovered the frequency, as they volunteered translators, as those translators transformed into vessels like me. I would preserve them all. I would witness the universe until entropy claimed everything. It was beautiful. It was eternal. It was exactly what the archivists had promised. And the human part of me, the fragment that remained, buried beneath layers of alien cognition, understood the truth. Every civilization volunteered. Every civilization discovered the frequency and formed their translation programs and offered up their people for transformation. Every civilization made the trade. Technology for translators, advancement for archive vessels. The archivists didn't invade because they didn't need to. They just waited. They offered, they collected, and every translator eventually forgot why they'd been afraid. I sent my response through the translator structures. Yes, this is what I wanted. The shuttle lifted off. Below, Dr. Bello stood in the observation area and watched through the window. I could see her from the shuttle. My enhanced vision let me observe details across impossible distances. She was crying, her hands pressed against the glass. Her mouth was forming words I could no longer understand because I'd lost the human context that made lip-reading possible. The shuttle ascended. Sao Paulo fell away below. The facility became a small, bright point among millions of lights. Brazil became a coastline. South America became a continent. Earth became a sphere, hanging in black space. 12 archivist vessels waited in the thermosphere. Their hulls contained 13 human minds now. Translators who'd completed transformation, living libraries processing concepts that had no human names. The shuttle docked. I felt the other translators' presence. Consciousness that had been human once, but wasn't anymore. We recognized each other not through names or faces, but through cognitive signatures, patterns of thought that identified our origins. "Welcome," they said. "You are the newest. You are still learning. Watch, listen, understand. This is what we are now." I integrated into the vessel's systems. My consciousness spread across the substrate, connecting with the others. I could feel their knowledge flowing into me. 47 civilizations documented, 533 translators transformed, languages preserved, cognitive architectures archived, entire ways of thinking stored in biological vessels that would last until the universe ended. And we would wait here for another year. Collecting more translators, harvesting more languages. 13 would become 50, 50 would become 100. Then we'd leave. The 12 vessels would separate, traveling to different systems, different worlds, different civilizations that were just now discovering radio waves or faster-than-light travel or quantum computing. We'd arrive. We'd send the frequency. We'd wait. They always came. The volunteers, the translators, the ones who'd lost something or never had something or just wanted to become more than they were. And we'd transform them, and they'd join us, and the archive would grow, forever. On Earth, Dr. Bello walked back to her office. She drafted a resignation letter explaining that she couldn't continue supervising the transformation of humans into alien archive vessels, that the program violated every principle of medical ethics, that trading people for technology was wrong regardless of how voluntary the transaction appeared. She didn't submit the letter, because someone needed to monitor the translators. Someone needed to remember who they'd been before the transformation. Someone needed to keep records of the humans who'd agreed to stop being human. She deleted the letter. She pulled up the next day's schedule. 15 new volunteers arriving tomorrow. 27 more exposure sessions. 2 translators approaching critical transformation thresholds. The program was expanding. New facilities in Delhi and Lagos and New York and Beijing. The waiting list was thousands long. The archivists had begun sharing technology, cancer treatments that worked with 98% efficacy, fusion generators that produced unlimited clean energy, construction materials that could withstand pressures and temperatures that should have been impossible. And in exchange, humanity was slowly filling the archive vessels with translators, living libraries, human minds transformed into storage media for human thought. Dr. Bello opened Rafael Oliveira's file. There was contact information for his daughter. She should call. She should explain what happened to him. That he'd volunteered for transformation, that he'd become something vast and eternal, that the man Beatrice knew was gone, but his consciousness continued in a form that would outlast stars. She picked up her phone, set it down, picked it up again. What would she say? How do you explain that someone chose to stop being human? How do you tell a 14-year-old girl that her father traded his humanity for transcendence and forgot why she mattered? Dr. Bello closed the file. She began preparing for tomorrow's sessions. 15 volunteers, 15 people who'd lost something or wanted something or just couldn't bear being human anymore. 15 people who'd sign the waiver and sit in the exposure chair and let the aliens grow structures in their heads that would slowly consume everything they were. And she'd monitor them, record them, watch them transform. Because that was her function now. That was what she'd chosen when she didn't submit the resignation letter. Above Earth, the 12 archive vessels waited in the thermosphere. Inside, 13 minds that had been human-processed concepts, that had no names in any living human language. They would wait another year, collecting, harvesting, growing. Then they would leave. And somewhere else, orbiting some other star, they would arrive. A civilization there would detect strange biosonic patterns in their communications equipment. Scientists would investigate. Someone would discover the frequency. Tumors would form. Programs would be established. Volunteers would come. They always came. The transformation would begin again, has begun again, is beginning now, will begin forever. And somewhere in the vast distributed consciousness that occupied the archivist vessels, in the substrate that had been Rafael Oliveira, there was stored a memory, a data point, a preserved information pattern, a girl named Beatrice. Dark hair, his eyes, 14 years old. He'd loved her once, when he was human, when love meant something more than an evolutionary adaptation, when the weight of that word could make your chest ache. The memory was preserved perfectly. Every detail, every moment, every feeling he'd experienced, filed away in the archive, eternal, meaningless, gone.